The day he froze my bank accounts, I stood in the middle of my kitchen holding 2 crying children, and realized I'd married a man who would rather destroy me than help me survive. But what he didn't know was that one day I'd take back everything he stole with interest. If you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or made to feel powerless, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and settle in. Because what started as heartbreak turned into one of the most satisfying cases of real-life karma I've ever lived through. The beginning of the end. When I first met him, I was 24, full of hope, and just beginning to build a career I loved. I worked in marketing, small company, decent pay, but more importantly, I felt independent. I'd grown up believing that love was supposed to be a partnership. 2 people supporting each other, building something together. When we got married, I really believed that's what we had. In the beginning, he was charming, protective in ways that, at the time, felt romantic. He'd say things like, "You don't need to stress about work, babe. I'll take care of you." I thought it was sweet. Who doesn't want to feel cared for? But looking back, that was the first small crack. I got pregnant with our first child about a year into the marriage. We were both excited, nervous, hopeful. But soon after the baby came, everything changed. He started pressuring me to quit my job. At first, it sounded like love. "You should stay home with the baby, I'll provide." But it wasn't really a choice. Every time I brought up returning to work, he'd start an argument. He'd accuse me of not caring about our child, of being selfish. Eventually, he broke me down emotionally to the point where I gave in. I left my job thinking it was temporary. It wasn't. The first few months as a stay-at-home mom were harder than I ever imagined. The nights were long, the days blurred together, and I started to lose pieces of myself. But worse than the exhaustion was the loneliness. He stopped being my partner and started being my warden. He controlled the money, criticized how I spent every dollar, even questioned why I needed me time. If I wanted to buy a new outfit or a small treat, he'd sneer. "Must be nice living off my paycheck." I used to cry quietly at night, afraid the sound would wake the baby. I told myself it was just stress, that things would get better once we found our rhythm. But they didn't. By the time I was pregnant with our second child, the arguments had turned into something darker. He started yelling, really yelling. Words that cut deep, ones I can still hear if I think too hard. He'd call me useless, lazy, say things like, "You don't contribute anything anymore." It was cruel irony. He'd forced me out of my job, isolated me, and then mocked me for being dependent on him. There were days when I'd stand at the kitchen sink, washing bottles, and feel like a ghost in my own house. Invisible, unheard, completely under his thumb. I remember one night, heavily pregnant, he came home drunk. I'd forgotten to switch the laundry, and he exploded. Threw a chair, slammed a door so hard the baby woke up screaming. That night I slept on the floor of my toddler's room, hugging my belly, whispering to my unborn child, "I'm so sorry. I'll figure something out. I promise." Then came the affair. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was little signs. Perfume on his clothes, late nights, the new cologne, the silence when I asked simple questions. When I finally confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He just laughed. "What do you expect? You've let yourself go. You're not exactly fun anymore." Something inside me cracked that day. But even then I stayed. Not because I loved him, but because I didn't know how to leave. I had no income, no family nearby, 2 small children, and a husband who'd made sure I had nowhere else to turn. I told myself I'd wait, save a little, plan quietly. But fate decided to speed things up in the ugliest way possible. The day he crossed the line wasn't about me. It was about our child. Our oldest, barely 5 years old, had spilled juice on the carpet. He screamed, grabbed the child's arm, and shoved him hard enough to make him fall. Something in me snapped. I didn't think, I acted. I pulled our child behind me and shouted at him to get out. I still remember the look in his eyes. Surprise, then rage, then disbelief. But this time I didn't back down. He left that night, shouting every insult he could think of. I locked the door behind him and sank to the floor, shaking, crying, but feeling something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. It was 2012. And that was the day my life began to fall apart, so it could finally come back together. The night I kicked him out, I thought the worst was behind me. I thought that standing up to him, finally saying no more, was the end of my suffering. But it was only the beginning. The morning after he left, the house was so quiet it hurt. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself knows something has changed. My kids were still asleep, their little faces soft, innocent, unaware that their world had just split in two. I made myself a cup of instant coffee, my hands shaking, staring at the tiny stack of bills on the counter. Rent, utilities, credit cards, groceries, and then I realized, had nothing. He'd always handled the money. Or more accurately, he'd made sure I couldn't. When I tried to check my bank account, it was frozen. I didn't even know that was possible. But somehow, he'd managed to call the bank and lie his way into locking me out. I remember standing there, phone in one hand, crying quietly while my toddler tugged at my sleeve asking for breakfast. That was the first time I said the words out loud. He's trying to ruin me. And I think part of me knew he would. He refused to give me a single dime. When I called him, desperate, asking for help with diapers or food, he laughed and said, "The courts haven't ordered me to give you a dime, so don't expect a penny." The cruelty in his voice was cold, calculated. He wanted to watch me fall apart. There were days I had to choose between paying the electricity bill and buying milk. Nights when I'd lie awake, terrified that I was failing my children, that they'd suffer because of me. But every morning I got up anyway. I cut coupons, found second-hand clothes, babysat for neighbors, anything to keep us afloat. I'd put the kids to bed and cry quietly in the bathroom so they wouldn't hear me. I wasn't strong yet. I was just surviving. When I finally filed for divorce, he showed up to the courthouse with that smug grin, like he was walking into a victory parade. He had a lawyer. I didn't. He lied to the court, to the bank, to anyone who would listen. Said I was unstable. Said I was making things up. He even tried to convince people I was keeping the kids from him. I was drowning, emotionally, financially, mentally. And then, one day, he crossed another line. I had filed for default in the divorce, because he wasn't showing up for court dates. That's when he showed up at my door, furious. I didn't even have time to lock it. He stormed in, shouting, accusing, and before I could react, he shoved me. It wasn't the first time he'd been physical, but it was the first time I saw something in his eyes, something that said he wanted me to break. But instead of breaking, called the police. He was arrested for assault. That was the day I promised myself I would never let him have that kind of power over me again. 6 months later, the judge finally ordered him to pay child and spousal support, $2,562 a month. For the first time I could breathe. But of course, he refused to pay until the garnishment kicked in. By then, he was already $6,000 behind. It was exhausting. Every victory felt temporary. But that $6,000 in back support became my golden ticket. It allowed me to get permission from the court to move away. And for the first time in years, felt hope. When I packed up the kids and our few belongings, I remember standing in the empty living room and thinking, we're leaving the pain here. We moved into a small rental. 2 bedrooms, thin walls, noisy neighbors, but it was ours. The kids slept peacefully that first night, and I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, staring at the ceiling with tears streaming down my face. They weren't sad tears. They were relief. Pure aching relief. I remarried a year after the divorce. My new husband was kind, gentle, patient, the kind of man who spoke softly and listened deeply. He wasn't trying to fix me. He was just trying to understand me. And after everything I'd been through, that felt like heaven. But, as I would later learn, peace doesn't always last. Not when your ex's ego has been bruised. Because years later, when I thought the storm had passed, he came back into my life with one goal: to destroy the peace I'd finally built. And that was the beginning of his downfall. I thought the hardest part was over when I kicked him out. But I was wrong. That was only the beginning of a different kind of battle. The quiet, exhausting kind that doesn't leave bruises but drains you from the inside out. The house felt emptier than ever. At night, I'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the indentation where he used to sleep. Not because I missed him, I didn't, but because that empty space reminded me of how much of myself I'd lost in trying to please him. Bills started piling up. My savings were almost gone, and my resume was dusty after years of being a housewife. Every rejection email hit like a small humiliation, a reminder of how I'd once given up everything for someone who treated me like nothing. But I had a little boy watching me. He was only 6, but his eyes carried questions he didn't know how to ask. And that was enough to push me forward. I started taking freelance gigs, small marketing projects I could do from home. At first, it was barely enough to buy groceries, but slowly I built momentum. Clients started recommending me. My laptop became my battlefield, and every dollar I earned felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity. Then came the custody hearings. He showed up in court in a brand new suit, fake charm dripping from his voice. He told the judge I was unstable, that I couldn't provide a proper home. He even tried to use my emotional breakdowns, the ones he caused, as evidence against me. And the worst part, he smiled while doing it. That smirk. The same one he used when he'd tell me I was overreacting. I remember sitting there, holding my lawyer's hand under the table, shaking, trying not to cry. Because crying was exactly what he wanted. The judge granted him shared custody. And that night, when I watched my son pack a small bag to spend weekends with his father, my heart cracked all over again. He still found ways to control me, even from a distance. Payments delayed, legal threats, petty emails about late pickups, and poor parenting. He'd send me texts just to twist the knife. Pictures of him and his new girlfriend playing happy family with my son. There were nights I sat in the car outside my apartment, crying quietly so my boy wouldn't hear. But those tears started changing. They weren't just pain anymore, they were fuel. I promised myself one thing. I would rebuild. Not just for me, but so my son would never think that mistreating someone was love. Months turned into a year. By then, my small freelance gigs had grown into a full-time business. I was working 12-hour days, teaching myself new skills, building connections, and finally, feeling like myself again. People began to notice. One client, a startup owner, told me, "You're brilliant. Have you ever thought about leading your own marketing firm?" The idea planted itself like a seed in my chest. And as I watched my ex flaunt his new life online, bragging about promotions and vacations, I quietly started writing a different story, one he'd never see coming. Because while he was busy showing off, I was building something powerful, something that would one day make him realize exactly what he threw away. And I didn't need revenge. Not yet. I just needed to keep surviving. They say revenge is best served cold. But in my case, it came dressed in professionalism, calmness, and silence. 2 years had passed since I'd walked away from that house. 2 years of rebuilding from nothing. My small freelance hustle had turned into a registered marketing agency with 3 employees, a growing list of clients, and a quiet reputation for getting results. I wasn't rich, but I was free. And that freedom had a flavor sweeter than anything money could buy. But just when life started to feel balanced again, karma decided to test my patience one more time, by sending him back into my life with a smirk and a subpoena. One morning, as I was preparing my son's breakfast, I heard a knock on the door. Courier handed me a thick envelope. Inside, in bold legal letters, were the words that made my stomach twist. Petition for full custody. Froze. The world went silent for a few seconds, except for the faint clinking of my son's spoon against his cereal bowl. My ex was claiming that I was unfit, that my growing business meant I was too busy to care for our son properly. He even attached screenshots of my online meetings, pretending they were proof that I was neglecting him. It was absurd, cruel, manipulative. But most of all, it was exactly who he was. The old me would have panicked. The woman I was becoming just took a deep breath and said quietly, "Not this time." I called my lawyer, the same one who'd helped me survive the first storm. When she read the papers, she sighed and said, "He's playing dirty again. But this time, you have something you didn't have before, power." And she was right. I had proof of everything. Every missed payment he'd forgotten. Every text where he refused to pick up our son. Every time he'd sent late-night insults or tried to control me. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to show the truth. The day of the hearing felt like déjà vu. Same courtroom, same polished wooden benches, same man pretending to be the victim. He strutted in wearing an expensive suit. His arm wrapped around his new fiancée. She had that same smug, pitying smile I once wore when I thought I knew the story. He spoke first, using all the right words: concerned father, child stability, maternal neglect. I watched him perform, calm and silent, taking notes. Then it was my turn. My lawyer stood up and started laying out the evidence. The financial records, the custody violations, the threatening messages he'd conveniently forgotten about. The courtroom got quieter with each exhibit. His confident posture began to sink inch by inch. And then came the moment that sealed everything. My lawyer played an audio recording. His voice, unmistakably his, saying, "You'll never make it without me. You're nothing without my money. One day, I'll take our son and you'll be begging to come back." His face went white. His fiancée turned to look at him. Eyes wide, disbelief painted across her face. You could feel the energy in the room shift. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was cold and deliberate. She looked directly at him and said, "This court sees no evidence that the mother is unfit. What we do see is a pattern of psychological manipulation and harassment." Then she turned to me. "Ms. Carter, full custody is hereby granted to you. The father's visitation will be supervised until further review." I couldn't breathe for a moment. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from relief, from victory. As we walked out of that courtroom, I didn't say a single word to him. But the look on his face said everything. That night, after putting my son to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the rain blur the city lights. For years I had dreamed of this moment. Not to hurt him, but to finally feel safe. And in that silence, I realized something. Revenge doesn't always come from destruction. Sometimes it's simply standing tall in the ruins they built to bury you. Weeks later, his new fiancée left him. Word spread through mutual friends that he'd been demoted at work too. Apparently, HR had found out about some inappropriate behavior with a junior employee. It was as if the universe had been keeping score all along. He tried reaching out, calling, emailing, even showing up at my office once. I didn't open the door. I didn't respond. Because karma had already done what I never could. And this time I didn't need to fight back. I just needed to watch him face himself. One evening, as I was tucking my son into bed, he looked up and asked softly, "Mom, why doesn't Dad live with us anymore?" I smiled gently and said, "Because sometimes, sweetheart, people forget how to love the right way. And when they do, we have to love ourselves enough to walk away." He nodded, sleepy-eyed, and whispered, "You're really strong, Mom." And in that moment I realized, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was winning. I walked to my desk later that night, where a small framed photo sat. Me and my son on the beach, wind in our hair, both of us smiling like the world couldn't touch us anymore. I whispered to that photo, to the woman I used to be, "See, you made it. And you didn't need to scream or beg or break. You just needed to rise." Outside, the rain had stopped. And somewhere deep inside me, the storm had too. Some victories don't come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with a single email notification, a small number on a screen, and the kind of stillness that feels like peace. It had been a year since the custody battle. My life had finally found rhythm. Mornings filled with coffee and sunlight, my son's laughter echoing through our small but warm home, and my business running smoother than ever. I'd learned to sleep without checking my phone for his messages. I'd learned to smile again without forcing it. I'd learned to live. But karma, as it turns out, wasn't quite done yet. It had one more surprise waiting. One that would tie every loose end in a way only the universe could script. One Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from a financial advisor. Someone from the firm that handled retirement accounts for my ex's old company. He sounded hesitant, polite. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you're listed as a beneficiary on a 401k plan belonging to Mr. David Carter. I just need to confirm if you're aware of this." Blink. "Wait, what? That can't be right. We've been divorced for years." He double-checked the file. "According to our records, he never updated the beneficiary after your marriage. Legally, the funds are still designated to you." I sat there in silence, the weight of irony settling over me like a slow sunrise. He had forgotten to remove my name, a simple oversight that would now cost him dearly. When the paperwork came through, I almost laughed. His 401k balance was substantial. Years of contributions, employer matches, and bonuses. And all of it was legally mine. My lawyer confirmed it, smiling the kind of smile only poetic justice can inspire. "Technically," she said, "you're entitled to it, unless he contests it, and given his current situation, I doubt he can afford to." Apparently, he'd been fired after multiple HR complaints. His engagement had ended shortly after. He was living with a friend, bouncing between jobs, blaming everyone but himself. And there I was, quietly transferring the funds into a savings account for our son's college education. Not revenge, just redirection, turning poison into purpose. A month later, he showed up outside my office again, older, thinner, humbled in a way arrogance never expects to be. He stood by my car, hands in his pockets, eyes darting to the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost human again. "I heard about the 401k. I guess I forgot to change it." I looked at him for a long moment. He was no longer the man who broke me, just a shadow of someone who thought he was untouchable. "I know," I said quietly. "You also forgot to treat people right." He winced. "I didn't think it would end like this." "Neither did I replied, opening my car door. "But you made your choices. And so did I." As I drove away, I didn't feel triumphant. Felt complete. Because justice isn't always about seeing someone fall. Sometimes it's simply about knowing you no longer have to. That night, after tucking my son into bed, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony. The city lights twinkled below, the kind of view that used to feel unreachable. Now it was mine. Every bit of it earned through tears, grit, and silence. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who walked on eggshells, afraid of her own dreams. And then I thought about the woman I had become, steady, grounded, unapologetically herself. He had taken years from me, yes, but I had taken my life back. And that, I realized, was the sweetest justice of all. I used some of the 401k money to open a small scholarship fund for single mothers trying to rebuild their careers. It wasn't much, but it felt right, like closing a circle. Because the real revenge was never about hurting him. It was about healing me, and showing my son that strength doesn't come from control. It comes from compassion. One evening, months later, my son came home from school holding a handmade Mother's Day card. He'd drawn the two of us under a bright yellow sun, smiling, holding hands. Below it, in uneven handwriting, he'd written, "You are my hero. You made our house happy again." I traced the letters with my fingertips, tears filling my eyes. Not sad tears, grateful ones. 'Cause that was it. That was my victory. Not the court ruling, not the money, not the karma. Just that one line from a child who saw me not as broken, but as whole. Sometimes I still drive past the old house, the one where I once lived like a ghost. The curtains are different now. The flowers I planted are gone. But when I stop at the red light outside, I don't feel pain anymore. Feel distance, freedom, is. And as I look at my reflection in the window, I see someone I never thought I'd find again me. Life has a way of balancing the scales, not through loud revenge, but quiet restoration. The people who break you will one day face themselves. And when that day comes, you won't need to lift a finger. You'll be too busy living. I used to think survival meant holding on. But now I know it means letting go. And the sweetest justice isn't watching them fall. It's watching yourself rise. If this story gave you goosebumps or reminded you that karma always comes back around, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen play out in real life? I love reading your stories.